right, welcome, Greg. I'm just going to give a little context to what we're talking about, and then we'll hit the ground running and probably take a few tangents and segues into different topics. But the key context is partly Steven Pinker.
Yep.
And that's in a broader context of the intellectual dark web for me, and a lot of commentators, and you and I have clashed over that for a long time. And so I want a definitive resolution, and I know if if we both take the right approach, that something like that is possible. Okay. And the specific context of this is when you posted on your email list this New York Times article that, relatively in a relatively balanced way for the New York Times, kind of discusses the open letter against Pinker, gives that some context, and a close read actually reveals that it is trying to honor the intention of the author, the signatories of that letter, that they they're not just trying to silence him. They're not really trying to impede his career. They're not critiquing his work in linguistics. They're critiquing him as a public figure and as a public intellectual, the way he talks and the way he presents himself. And I would lobby those same critiques against you and many others that are sympathetic to the IDW. Now, when you posted your email, I'll just, quote some of the key words. You said it's a disturbing development. They're ridiculous attacks. It needs to be strongly rejected. We don't want to move towards this Orwellian thought police, and you stand by Pinker 100%. And I had an article handy at the time from the Telegraph that was a response to this issue and kind of like critical of Pinker, and I thought about sending it, but I, just because we'd clashed in the past, I just thought, you know what, forget it. Greg is not entertaining criticism here. He's 100% with Pinker. I'm tempted to want to get off this list because I've just had it with this culture of denial and hyperbole and projection. But here we are today because you reached out to me when I did reply to a different thread. And actually, we seem to converge on the issue of MMT. So that's something we can touch on at some point.
Sure.
But I've got a fair bit of notes here from different articles that synthesize, and of course I've critiqued Pinker in my IDW critique in 2018, just in a few paragraphs. But basically, a lot of what's happening today echoes my critique, and my critique was trying to echo some of the extant critiques out there, which again is just basically that Pinker, for a linguist, it's super ironic that he's very tone deaf to these issues and he doesn't know how to speak about them. And so the conflict becomes, oh, he's not meeting the standards of the way people want him to talk about this. Let's harangue him. Let's publicly humiliate him. But the fact remains is his critics are not just random people. The signatories, over 600 people on this open letter, included 20% tenured faculty or retired, right? So real professors, and just generally they're pretty serious. Again, like I echoed that they're not trying to take him down for this or that. They're trying to make a pointed critique that they want to be taken seriously. And the secondary problem is that the media itself, the pundits, whoever is writing articles for the New York Times or the Atlantic, typically does not do deep research, does not interview the signatories, does not expand on this issue. They try to suppress it. And I feel you're doing the exact same thing. And, I think to your own discredit, you use hyperbole to make a stronger point, but it ends up going too far, so to the point that, the way you framed your position to me in the latest email was that, you know, there's a moralistic mob, this anti-racist religion, they're crossing into the absurd. And it doesn't, it's not fair to the actual substance of the argument, of the nuance of the debate here. And so it makes you angry, it makes me angry. We all get very angry because it makes me hate Pinker more. Really.
Okay.
I mean, I have
Well,
less and less patience for him, for his serious work, because he's
yeah,
so tone deaf, because he puts his own career, his own ego ahead of everybody else.
right.
And so
Well,
the stakes are quite high. Yeah.
yeah, I agree. So as I said when we came in, I thought the best thing to do to join around this issue is to sort of steelman each other's position. So that's what I would invite us to start off doing, because you know, I like you, Brent. I think we're at a place, you know, where there is too much, um, you know, rhetoric and hyperbole, and certainly there is a time for it, you know, and I'll certainly engage in it at times. Um, and I stand by what I said, but I think it has to be framed in a context so that it's not like I'm here, you know, to dismiss the whole movement towards racial justice you know, it's absurd. Obviously, the exact converse, as anyone that knows me knows. I've been concerned about social issues since my first year in undergraduate, and have devoted my life to issues. So we're just going to see, you know, the pathways in different ways. So let's just try to create nuance. So let's start with me. I would like to begin with me steel manning the open letter, and saying, yeah, why did people, you know, what were they trying to do? I mean, basically, they were saying that Pinker was being irresponsible in his language uses as a linguist. He's a media, you know, go-to media person and a fellow that represents the linguistic society. Um, and the recent statements about racial justice and the processes that their society seems to hold up to, his tweets going back to 2011 seem to violate a lot of those. And therefore, why should he be the go-to person when, as you said, he's tone deaf and he tends to use these kinds of frames that are not congruent with the emerging sensibility and the political justice movements that are so important to leverage and reverse the structural inadequacies that are so pervasive in our lives.
Yeah. But okay. So that's pretty good. But you don't completely believe that, right? Like this gets to my point of you being inclined to defend Pinker.
Right. I think I think they're misguided. And I think that, as I told you in the email that I sent, so now we can then, I mean, I'm happy to then reverse and you can steal. I mean, so that's their position. And I certainly can enter that mentality. And at every individual level and the rationale that would give rise to the letter, it's not hard for me to empathize. That's my whole point. And I want to make sure that I'm not personally calling anybody ridiculous or anything along those lines. I believe we're at a place in the political discourse. I believe we're at a place across a wide variety of different polarizing areas that is deeply problematic for the advance of dignity, well-being, and integrity for our social systems. Okay, that's what I believe. I believe that the academy, and this is where you and I will probably disagree, the academy, and when I say that, I mean the academic institutions and the ethos and morality, has been captured by an anti-racist, anti-sexist ideology, okay, that then is very close to engaged in thought police and language policing, um, and now knows that the proper way to think is to be aware of the history of structural inequality and make sure your language games conform to that and then counterbalance that in an anti-racist, anti-sexist way. Else, if you fail to live up to that, else you are complicit with the history of colonialism, and you're complicit with structural inequalities that have so
Mhm.
obviously differential equitable outcomes that you're now a part of a white supremacist society, and you better get your thoughts and language in line. That's what
Yeah.
I'm experiencing.
Yeah. So, and their message, the way that you kind of genuinely just sort of paraphrased it there, does have a lot of hyperbole, right? Like just extreme, you know, kind of ultimatums, like, yeah, agree with us or you're an idiot. Uh, However, this is the crux of it, right? Why do I not get offended by that? And you and many others do get offended by that. When we both agree that there's some nugget of truth there. And I would like, just to be clear, I would disagree with the characterization that it is always hyperbolic. Like, I agree that there is a lot of, hyperbole and shouting people down and
Sure. Of course, there's a lot of
cancellation,
people who
but
represent that with nuance.
but I don't get offended by it. And every time I talk to another white man, ostensibly, like, about these issues, I try to pose that question. Like, if there's a black comedian or a black scholar or whoever who is like, yeah, white people suck, why am I able to smile and nod along with that, and other people get offended? And I'll try to steelman this a little bit and say, well, it's probably because you're in a position where you're afraid of losing your job or something, and I'm not. I'm already positioned as a critic, and I want to just go along with it because I appreciate that sentiment. But this is the point, though. It's like, it's just an expression. And, like, if we say white people suck, what does it mean? Or whiteness is bad, the idea of whiteness, right? These are really important, sort of on the conceptual level, to be able to
Absolutely.
critique the idea of whiteness beyond the superficial skin color that we share, right?
Completely.
And so that's what I want to foreground.
Right. Well, we can foreground that. We know, I mean, the emergence of genuine racist ideology, at least in Western European structures, comes off you know, certainly it's pre-Enlightenment, but essentially gets sort of sanitized and scientized in the Enlightenment, whereby you have the idea of a now baked in set of justifications that legitimize the superiority of men over women and whites over blacks, that then is seen to grant some sort of absolute transcendent reality that goes into biological natures and then creates a justification for a hierarchy in the social strata that then manifests itself in unbelievably horrifying ways, like 12 million Africans being shipped from
Yeah.
Africa into the labor structures of the
Yeah.
United States and other, unbelievable disaster. So,
And
so racist
yeah.
ideology is built in. And when we talk about the history of white supremacy and the concept of whiteness in the European tradition, that's baked into the concept. We better be aware of that.
Yeah. And then flash forward to our present day, contemporary age, most people are just sort of ignorant of these things. And, my generation, even the way we're educated, like, each generation, it gets progressively more, historicized and honest, and, rather than whitewashed. It seems to improve, at least in some places. Of course, in some
Oh,
places
it's
it doesn't
definitely
improve at
improved
all.
enormous.
But there's still a general kind of white culture. It's sort of apathetic, it's complacent. And so, would you agree to some extent that white people suck? Like, even like, we're being a bit tongue in cheek here, but you're agreeing with the substantive point underneath, that there's a pointing to a
Right.
cultural
So,
problem. And I would say that this is framed under capitalism too. That capitalism is the
capitalism
overarching
plays a role in this.
matrix of, insanity that frames and generates a lot of these issues.
Well, the capital labor relations create all sorts of aspects of hierarchy, which then feed back into the social category hierarchies, clearly. So, I mean, we can
Yeah.
dialogue about whether capitalism and the entire Enlightenment. I mean, was the
Mhm,
modern
mhm,
Enlightenment a good thing, or was it a
mhm,
disastrous thing? And the answer would
mhm.
be, well, I don't know that there's a yes/no answer to that at all.
Yeah. So it
You
seems to
then.
me, yeah.
So when you start talking about, so here's the, I differentiate between a sociological and structural level of analysis, okay, and a human psychological level of analysis. And I see people failing over and over and over and over again to make that effective differentiation. I think a lot of what Pinker's tweets are about is positioning some of those, and we can get into some of the specifics. So the idea of whiteness sucks, white people sucking at any particular level that puts a
Mhm.
person on it. I'm now all of a sudden I'm like, oh God, that's the kind of, to me, toxic. That's a
Mhm.
toxic version of anti-racism
Right.
that now all of a sudden is going to actually just should we just, all right, so let's lock up a lot of white people and ship white people back to Africa, and now all of a sudden we have a
Yeah.
balance in relation. I mean, that
Right.
to me is unbelievably twisted
Right.
and
But
not at all.
nobody's actually saying this. But this is, I agree, this is the problem in the linguistic framing of saying white people suck. But so this is why I call this IDW culture reactionary, because it's reacting to the literal statements of some of these groups sometimes, like if defund the police or Black Lives Matter. It's like the spectrum from liberal academics to like Trump himself and MAGA people,
Mhm.
is to the response is to get up in arms and about that and take everything literally, not get into any of the nuance. So that it's unfortunate
Beautiful.
the message
Yeah,
gets lost in things like defund
that's
the
right.
police, Black Lives Matter. But
I think we'll agree on that.
yeah.
And I love the fact that you're highlighting, and certainly this is certainly I highlight, is that these claims have to be placed then in context to determine their legitimacy. Okay. So I live in Stewart's Draft, Virginia, 95% white Christian, 75% Trump supporter. When we stick out our Biden signs, they get ripped down. Okay. So that's the culture I live in. All
I'm
right.
so sorry, Greg.
Okay. So, I mean, it's, whatever. People are just doing their thing. All right. But listen, and are these folks woke? No, obviously.
Mhm.
Do they understand the history of white supremacy in a particular way? I will say, thankfully, whatever's changed over the last 5 years, we see a lot less Confederate flags around here. Okay. And my kids at the same time, what do my kids see? Very little in the way of official racism, I would say. Now, obviously, they're white and there aren't too many white, but my kids are Jewish. My wife's Jewish. They're raised Jewish. Um, when they were young, they sat in school where the other kids went out off school grounds during the school day and had weekly religious education where they learned that if they believe Christ is their savior, they'll go to heaven. And then they came back. So I know a little bit about sort of feeling in a minority role. Certainly my kids. So what am I saying? The critique of an appreciation of issues of sensitivity, of issues of structural inequality, of what that means in relationship to our history, of the embrace of a white identity that ties into a Confederate flag, needs the systems in Stewart's Draft, Virginia, need need education along those lines, absolutely. And there is a systematic and pervasive sort of certainly not explicit. Well, some people are obviously, but not too many people are explicitly. At least I haven't encountered. If you do the studies, 5%, 10% may fill in a block that I say Black people are lesser. But even around
Mhm.
here, that's pretty rare that I get. But an implicit structural, implicit bias, a prejudicial attitude, a stereotyping, all of that, of course, that's present. That's part of the legacy. And that's
Yeah.
unfortunate and we would want people to help waken. Now, I'll finish the point. When I go up to James Madison University, okay, having been trained in unpacking your white knapsack, having been trained in issues of diversity, I see it everywhere that there is a white guilt and white sensitivity and all of these issues. Okay. And And the idea that there's a pervasive racism at the culture of James Madison University, I mean, now we can get into dialogue about that. And so when we start to apply the rhetoric to where James Madison University is, okay, versus where Stewart's Draft is, I'm like, yeah, there's two radically different contexts, okay? So the Trump supporting MAGA people is one thing, the academic left is another thing. And I have very different reactions to the message depending on what context I'm in. If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
I get that from that perspective, they can seem very distant, right? But from, let's say I'm on the far left, right? If you want, I'll own that. It looks like they cover for each other. I'm not saying that that's intentional or that's, you know, whatever, but that is the effect, and that's part of the critique of the IDW. Now, you just touched on some points which I really like, which are that, you know, I've written about this, it's been written about a lot, but that racism since the 60s onward became more coded and sublimated and invisible. And this is a very serious thing because it means it's harder to understand, it's harder to prosecute, it's harder for, even for the racist people to know that they're racist. It literally becomes a part of their just their lives and their worlds without the consciousness of calling each other slurs.
You're absolutely right. It's harder.
I don't think the IDW gets this at all.
This is where, so this is right. Okay. So,
because that's the 60s and it's just intensified until today. It's invisible.
Right. So, okay. So this is exactly right. So there are multiple meanings of the word racism. I like three different things. Okay. So explicit ideological racism, traditionally white better than black. Okay. And I believe that, follow that. Okay. What's that? And that has tremendously changed since the 1960s. We've seen that. There's implicit bias and prejudice. Okay. That has the stereotyping factor. You know, if John calls for a job versus, a more African American sounding black name, then we balance those and who gets called back, and we see then bias and prejudice in action. And we see then systematic community, historical, who has voting power, who has those kinds of representation in media, who has these kinds of issues of leverage to then create the structural flow of resources in the system. So you got structural racism, institutional bias, you get explicit prejudice, and then you get bias and prejudice that's then baked into the microaggression world. Okay, so those are the three, and those are all very different things. And I think everybody's in agreement that's at least quasi-enlightened that explicit racism's a nightmare. Okay, right? And that's absolutely prohibited. Then we get into the whole issue about, well, what is the structuralism, racism, right? And what are the implicit biases? Now, you just said exactly what, you use your term, far left, whatever, would be, well, it went subterfuge and went underground and still plays an unbelievably impactful, nightmarish, it's got serious negative consequences. Okay. And I don't dispute that. I will also say it's a hell of a lot harder to see. And it's a lot easier also to project and say that it's there because it's there rather than it's actually there. And I'll flip this around and give you an example that I just had yesterday. So we had in our department level faculty meeting, we had equity conversations and training. Okay, that's what we just had yesterday. So I then was placed into a group where we had to address the gender equity of the members of the department. And what are the challenges that we face for gender equity? And what are the opportunities that we face for gender equity? Okay, that's the fundamental presupposition. I live in a department where under the provost is a woman, the dean's a woman, the department head's a woman. Okay, we have I think 65% women of faculty, 60% women faculty. And, it's complicated. I'll put you right there. For me to look out and see my feeling, I look out at the landscape. I don't see gender inequity dramatically favoring men in my context. In fact, my experience these days is actually, as a man, you're looked at with suspicion. You're looked at with negativity. There's a presumption of inequity that then is just seen. I'll give you a concrete example. I was talking with somebody and they were like, well, notice that virtually all the program directors are women, and program directors require a lot of service. Isn't it interesting that women get pulled into the service role? Now, I've been program director. I completely agree with her. It's a hell of a lot of service. But in my particular department, there were 4 program directors in a row that were men. And guess what the feedback was when the 4th was a man? Isn't it interesting that men take the leadership role of program directors and they acquire power that way? Okay. So I was like, all right, we just had the exact same structure, but because the gender equity lens is so powerful, we see one as being sacrificing as a function of service, and we see the women having to deal with that. And we then see the motive of the man as acquiring power. Okay. Now, I don't know what's true or not, but I can tell you that given how difficult it is to see, you're going to get a lot of projection depending on the lens you use. And I didn't think it was very helpful just to have a presumption of inequity. And then with no data, with no discussion, with no analysis, we then had to get together and then talk about the challenges to make it more equitable, whatever the heck that would mean.
Right.
So that's some of my experience inside the academy is that it's a trope itself that this is going on.
Yeah.
And if you push back it as a white man, like you were sort of suggesting, it's like, well, it's because I'm defensive, it's because I don't really care about women's rights, it's because I'm trying to protect my job and my power. And it doesn't feel that way, I'll tell you that, but I'm happy to explore my own ego in these structures, if that all makes sense.
I think I get all that. And I would, when I'm given the opportunity, and if I'm not, because I'm not employed in those types of situations, I'm not directly exposed to it. I have a friend who works for the government, and we talk about this often because he has to go through these diversity and equity meetings, and it's uncomfortable for him. And I get that. And if I was in those positions, I would be trying to intervene in the kind of middle of those issues and say, we need structural reform. And Alexander Bard, when I talked to him, made a great point that I've been making for a long time, and it applies in a parallel way to the gender issue too. But talking about racism, the war on drugs, right? You want to end systemic racism, you got to end the war on drugs, right? And that's why all this tweaking and meetings and whatever is frivolous. It's superficial when it's not about sort of real systems change. But all of this discourse served to interrupt the political opportunity for systems change, which was the Bernie Sanders plan. So Bernie Sanders wanted to end the war on drugs. He wasn't always going on about identity politics. I'd say, let's say 25% of his rhetoric was identity politics. Sometimes 75% was substantive policy systems change. But all of the IDW was against that. They got in the way of that. And the establishment, the media, all the major pundits, just a firefight, and both sides are losing. And it was always this outside insurgent grassroots movement that actually was proposing the solutions. And so it's a major tragedy on this front that this goes on. And we have now Biden. It's just totally heartbreaking and insane and absurd to me. So you and others want to call these social justice advocates absurd and whatnot, but the status quo that we're presented with is far more dangerous, far more like it's it presents itself as moderate and responsible and whatnot. But Biden doesn't want to end the war on drugs. He doesn't want to address climate change.
Well,
so
this
situation is getting reproduced, and that's why it's intensifying. It's going to keep intensifying. You have
Well, I want to get out of it. I mean, I think we probably, for me, I think I heard Zach Stein use the term meta-political or whatever. I find myself using meta too much, and Bard's yelling at me all the time. So sorry, Bard, if you're listening, if I use meta. But the point of it is that, I want to sidestep. So here's my basic frame of reference. The political parties are, I'll use a Brent Weinstein. They got the duopoly. They attack each other. They really are designed to keep them more and more. They're really structured to keep people hating each other in polarizing ways. I came out very early. 2011 is one of my first blogs on legalization of marijuana. And the most important reason was because of the racial inequity, of employment of disciplinary measures against blacks using marijuana is outrageously different, okay, and horrifying. And of all the reasons to legalize marijuana, from my vantage point, that's arguably the most important. So if you want to, I completely agree, and I think that many of the people in the IDW would not be. If we broke these issues up, it'd be, if we could get out of the all or nothing kind of issue, and find our way to see, well, what's the problem? What's the need? My friend Mike Muscolo and I talk a lot about what are the ways you build common ground. You stop getting in positions and you get into needs and problems, and you dialogue about where you'd solve needs and problems. And then you get a lot more agreement. You get a lot more constructive agreement. It's a lot more value driven and community building rather than divisive and destructive.
Yeah. I want to zoom in on this point though, just briefly, because like I followed the IDW closely. I know it well. I've critiqued it in depth.
I know.
And, yeah. So the point is like, Jordan Peterson, verbatim gave a talk titled "White Privilege is a Marxist Lie." That is a far right like dog whistle if I ever heard one. It's insane. There's nothing academic about a statement like that. And he gave that speech. He's given that sort of speech numerous times, but he gave that speech once at Trump hotels of all places. And just picture that, the optics of that, right? And
listen, I don't agree with everything Peterson does by any stretch. He found himself, in my opinion, he drove himself into the polarization and then got himself polarized so that then he became part of the destructive force that he could force, in my opinion.
I mean, So anyway. I in my first article about him, I tried to sort of steelman just his work generally, his approach to abstraction. I tried to foreground that he's done some serious work, just like the critics do of Pinker, and that's not even, not going into any of Peterson's like, quote unquote scientific studies on like alcoholism and stuff. I don't read those kind of papers. It is what it is. Good for him. But Peterson, I like, and I don't like using him as an example, but he really, and the IDW as a whole, helped drive the wedge in the discourse between a lot of communities that you'd think would get these things and would bring people like us together. It drove people like us apart because he's giving the world permission to say white privilege isn't even real. And we're sitting here agreeing to some extent. Well, obviously it's real historically. It's a thing. We can measure it. We can talk about it. It's also a construct to some extent, and so and so what, how did that all go? There wasn't any real resolution. There was a lot of critique from the left. And this speaks to my point to you, is I provided you with an article that actually listed 24 other articles. Like, thank God someone else has done the homework for us, right? And that the person who wrote that Medium post was actually a fellow in the Linguistic Society of America, right? And it was a great little article, and had all the 24 other articles that were defending the open letter. But I'll quickly make a point to bring it back to sort of some common ground, just to say that the article did make a little mistake, and it said, well, none of the mainstream media articles like Atlantic, New York Times, really honestly conveyed the intent of the signatories of the letter. And going back to the New York Times letter, as I said at the outset, it did actually present a sort of balanced perspective. And so there's a ton of nuance here, but my broad point is just that the people controlling the conversation, in this case Pinker, and to some extent you by proxy, unless you and I are in discourse like we are now, we're just moving backwards, and again, Bernie really did have the sort of platform to deploy on all of these issues and have a real systemic change, and the whole Peterson thing just helped move the culture right. And it really comes to a fever pitch with the debate a couple weeks ago and Trump saying, oh, critical race theorists are the real racists. This is
Mhm.
something that the Peterson types have been saying for a long time. And when you say anti-racist ideology, it sounds like a dog whistle for that same thing. But you yourself are distancing yourself from Trump and that sort of attitude. So it creates this huge distance politically between us all. When I'm arguing everybody should be actually going to the left, politically converging, building consensus, so you can elect the right people. And we can have less and less of these frivolous debates or equity and diversity meetings, which paper over the deep systemic roots of the problem. And
Okay,
we're in
well,
a kind
there's
of
a
too
lot.
little too late situation, right? With Biden
Right. Well,
versus Trump. It's just a
well,
joke.
right. Well, now, I mean, obviously, I have a very clear preference myself, but away from Trump, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll see. So, I mean, you just throw out a lot of different things there that I can respond to. There, to me, I want to be clear. There is an extreme anti-racist ideology that is sweeping and doing so in a way that I believe has a totalitarian bent to it inside of the academy. I respect Peterson called this out, and this is where I have respect for him. I do. Okay. Now he got trapped as so much of happens in our system. It's so polarizing and divisive that you have to feel like you have to be on a team. He got in some of that, and then it, to me, got pulled in an unproductive light. I certainly wish we could figure out a way to get out of the political polarization and more into the issues. Okay. I believe that we need a fundamental transition toward what I call social capital. Okay. And I use my theory for this. So my theory says that we are motivated as human beings, and then we can create a fractal from human psychology into the social world. We're motivated by what I call social influence and relational value. Okay. And that means that we track our degree that we can influence the others and compare about others and compare to our past. And we also track the extent to which we are authentically known and valued by important others. Those relationships are closely related, but they're also separable. Okay. Capitalism tends to separate them and create social influence as the instrumental power structure that then incentivizes our relations, creates efficiency and bottom line dynamics where everybody is then an instrumental mode or tool in an instrumental system that fundamentally kills the soul. Okay. We have to fund that. It also did a lot of good things, as Daniel Schmachtenberger, it's a paperclip turner that actually turns the world into, we're sitting here having all sorts of power as a function of it. But it also is very, very dangerous because it alienates the shit out of us. It puts us in competition. It game A's us in particular ways. Okay. So I want to say
Yeah.
that the structure itself needs a fundamental reset.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly concur with you that our values need to shift, and we need to figure out how to cultivate a sense of relational value. I think that
Yeah.
there are leaders, and I have identified, for example, Greg Thomas, who I'm definitely promoting. He's a Black intellectual who understands the vision of how to transcend race in the cosmos and recognize the issues of white supremacy. And it's what drawing off of Albert Murr, it's folklore of white supremacy and the fake lore of Black failure,
Mm-hmm.
and how to recognize that in the words of Albert Murray, we can be an omni-American
Mm-hmm.
Black-white weave
Mm-hmm.
that has respect and pride for both cultures, and realize that America is that, and then look to the future for the kind of dignity, well-being, and integrity where we actually ultimately figure out a way to transcend race and be authentic people. I mean, that's, to me, is a fundamental vision. And I think there
Yeah.
are brilliant leaders that are that have that vision. I think he's one of them. And I think that our task is to try to find
Yeah.
those individuals to at least to lead the charge on the race issue. And then there are other individuals. And I think Bernie has brilliant things to say. I certainly do.
Yeah.
We have a lot of agreement in many places.
Yeah. You mentioned Game B, so let's talk about that for a bit. So I've critiqued Game B.
Yep.
Have you read my critique?
Not in a huge amount of detail.
Mm-hmm.
I know I've tracked your stuff
Mhm.
you know, I'm tracking lots of things these
Yeah.
days. So,
Yeah. It's
you
good
know,
if someone's even
uh,
just remotely aware, but
I'm aware. Obviously, I
you know,
track you, Brent.
I want to lean into it though,
Mhm.
because when people ignore the critique, it's just kicking the can down the road. And I really stuck my neck out to do that critique. And people like Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachtenberger think they're above it, which I find reprehensible. And Jim Rutt is going to have me on his podcast soon.
Oh,
But
good.
he himself also thinks he's above it and kick the can down the road 6 months, right? And so I had to do a lot of work to repair that relationship and open the door. And so, we have a lot to talk about besides that, but I think my critique is important. And when I talked to Jim just after I was kicked out of the Facebook
Mhm.
group 6 months back, and the first thing he says is like, well, we're not going to talk about what happened. You know, we were focused on politics
Mhm.
instead, which was, sort of adjacent, but he's like, you didn't want to talk about why I was kicked out, who kicked me out, etc. He didn't want to talk about any of that. And from a few months later, he had a race working group on Facebook, which I
Mhm.
was a part of, and that blew up, not because of me. You can put the blame on me, but that, I wasn't the cause. But Jim was trying to understand the issue, to his credit, but he was also trying to control the issue
Mhm.
and the
Mhm.
discourse and everything. And it came to, again, this kind of climax or nadir where Jim is saying, okay, no terms from critical race theory, ban critical race theory. And that's just, on the face of it, that's just anti-intellectual. And so I get, we're trying to meet halfway, right? But to completely try to throw out a discourse to say no scholars from that field can be introduced, no concepts, no whiteness, nothing. It's like, okay, how are we going to talk about this? Jim Rutt, an old white guy who, like, he doesn't try to hide the fact that he's kind of
Mhm.
reactionary. You're going to lead the issue. Okay. How's that going to go? Right. This is the track we're already on. And so my critique of game B, before I got kicked out, was that what was happening was I was getting attacked just for uh, bringing up issues about social justice or socialism or
Mhm.
Marxism or race or whatever, and not even in a direct way, but sometimes it was tangential to my argument. Like, here's an article on Black metamodernism.
Mhm.
People, a lot of, I have allies in the group, but most people, including the moderators, were just very anti-intellectual about it, very dismissive. They were defending the racists, people attacking me, people saying that Rush Limbaugh is not racist, for example. Rush Limbaugh's built his whole profile on this kind of crypto racism, just far right, uh, stuff. And then, Trump, gives him a Medal of Freedom, right? And I think we agree too. It's not to say like, oh, Trump is racist, and then the other people say, oh, he dated a black woman, he can't be racist. That's a very superficial level, because the deeper systemic critique is that racism gets coded and invisible, and in fact Trump's policies and business model does carry on it perpetuates these forms of abuse that the contemporary social justice religion or anti-racist ideology is flailing to confront, because they've had all of their tools taken away. All they have is like experimental forms of activism and scholarship, and so it just creates this impasse. So anyways, that was a long way around the fact that I critique game B and they
Mhm.
all think they're too good for it. And again, not to put the burden too much on you, but people like you, John Vervaeke, who I talked to, Zach, even invoke all this game B language, game A, game B, whatever,
Mhm.
with, paperclip maximizers, without addressing the deep problems within game B and within that community and the type of people they foster and the type of discourse they foster. So what the fuck is that all about?
Well, because we have different, I mean, we have different lenses and different things are, to use John Vervaeke's relevant and realization systems for it.
Yeah.
You hone in on that in a particular kind of way that I don't. And, so there it is. I mean, for better or for worse, that's what
Mhm.
our different positions are. I mean,
Yeah, I'm trying to dig into the nuance here, though.
Mhm.
Like our entry point into this is the Pinker stuff, and we agree
Right.
that
So we can come back to the Pinker stuff if you want to understand
but I think
why,
the game
or
B is,
anyway,
Brett
whatever.
Weinstein, IDW
Yep.
adjacent. And so part of
Mhm.
my critique against that and my critique against integral communities and emerge is just they keep wanting to lead all these conversations without really embracing the anomalies, embracing the tough truth, trying to thread the needle. And then when shit hits the fan, like a pandemic, and the protests, after the George Floyd killing, and before and after, they're like, oh, we're the experts, and now we're going to talk about this. I was trying to talk about this in February when the election, there was really potential for it to fork and still go to Bernie. I was trying to
Mhm.
talk about that, and they're all just suppressing it. So this is a very serious issue. Like, and they should take responsibility. We should all take an enormous amount of responsibility for our actions and how these things play out. So Jordan Hall and Jim Rutt being against Bernie is deeply, deeply irresponsible on an intellectual level, on a public figure level. And you've agreed with me to some extent that Bernie is good, has some great
Yeah,
platform.
but I supported Biden definitely over
Okay, so
Bernie
I think, yeah, I think this,
100% because there's no
had we
way.
had we had these debates years ago,
Mhm.
we would have been on a different track. I think it's wrong
Mhm.
to have supported Biden in the primary.
I mean, obviously, that's what voting is, and it's opinion.
Is it though? I mean, I'm trying
Of
to get
course.
into the depth of it here to, if
Well,
we're doing
my
agenda
listen,
work.
my frame of reference is pretty simple from my vantage point. Yeah, I mean, listen, because everyone has different values. Like, how
Uh-huh.
much does it matter? It matters enormously to me that Trump's character is profoundly corrupt. That matters a lot to me. So I'm a psychologist. I think about fundamentally the role models that we have, the vacuousness of a character who doesn't care at all about intellectual integrity, when I believe that this is something we need to model and value, that eats at my soul. Okay. If my whole value, as some people tell me, was abortion, and I cared about individuals, I thought that as soon as somebody was, impregnated, and then there's a soul, and every one of those is a murder. Could there be a justification? Well, you're packing the courts in a particular way. So, I mean, people are going to have different values. That's the whole politics. I mean, they're different. For you, there's a salience around issues of social structure and power and the need for that kind of reform towards a more socialist and away from capitalist frame of reference. Okay, great. I mean, I can empathize with that at the level of the idea that that's as,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how are you going to then decide what
Yeah.
is, most valuable? So for me, I don't think that there's a really good chance that Bernie was going to have a harder time. I believe that. Um,
Right.
so then I make
And
a value in relationship to that. And then I'm like, well, I want to get
mhm,
Trump out because that's
yeah. And so this is a particular important point that that is what a lot of the conflicts came down to is people like yourself and Jim thought Biden had a better chance of winning. And
Mhm.
so no, look, we can pivot off the race issue altogether. Um, just so on this point, it's like, okay, well, hold on, let's pause for a second and say, is that true? Because over the past few years, there's been a lot of research and discourse around this particular point. Who does beat Trump, right? Does Hillary Clinton beat Trump? I mean, it was close, but there was a lot of, post facto analysis. Bernie would have won. And I think that's true. Of course, we
Mhm.
can't verify it, but
Of
there's a
course.
lot of evidence. The weight of evidence suggests that Bernie would have won. And so this isn't just an issue of, well, I have my political values, you have yours. It's like, if we actually dig into it, we could probably resolve this issue. And that's what I wanted to do with Jim. and yourself before and
But
say you're taking a huge risk. And so is Obama, and the whole establishment that's backing Biden is really taking a gamble just to keep their establishment figure in, when we don't really know if Biden will beat Trump, right? The polls always showed that Bernie had a better chance. And of course, if the establishment got behind Bernie instead of the other way around, oh, I mean, then it would have been no contest, right? Then we have unity, the unity we always wanted on the left. But Jim, in my simplification, Jim was effectively lying about Bernie, saying, oh, the Green New Deal is state socialism, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to write an article and debunk it, which never happened. And so, again, we're in this situation where we're just not addressing, honestly, the biggest levers of change here, because the Game B group didn't want to talk about politics. And I think if we used all of our techniques and openness to address that directly, we'd immediately start being on a better path. And I think it's a coin toss still who's going to win, even though Trump has COVID. It's like we live in such a fucked up post-truth time. Biden is not a great candidate. I mean, you can put all your
I certainly don't. I agree with you there.
yeah, I mean, you can have your reasons, but at the end of the day, and especially at this point, like, I want him to win. I'm with Chomsky. I'm with everybody who says, yeah, vote for Biden. We don't have, vote the lesser evil, for God's sakes. We don't have time to mess around.
All right, brother, then, well, there it is.
Yeah, but that's not the end of the story, right? The way it continues is, okay, we need to pressure, we need to agree, actually, so we can have the tipping point to put pressure on Biden to be this generation's FDR or LBJ that actually helps push forward some major policies that reorganize society. Yeah, like you said, along more socialist lines, because I'm a sociologist. I can have a very real, grounded discussion about that. That's totally depoliticized, and it's in all of our interests. It's in Game B's interests to close the wealth gap, right? And the way to do that is just not just voting for your dude and hoping things work out. It's like Bernie wants Biden to win because the third parties don't have a shot this election, and it's the only chance to build unity. But Biden, whether it's messaging or he really believes it, he keeps punching left. He keeps pushing away the socialist movement, which is an enormous amount of people, and he keeps courting Republican voters, right? Is that the best strategy? We don't know. I mean, it's going to be a horror show if Biden loses and we have to have 4 more years of this kind of divisiveness and polarization.
Listen, man, I mean, yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, the speculation of, I mean, I what I do, I'm building this unified theory of knowledge. I mean, that's where it takes plenty of my time. I find the political arena to be unbelievably toxic. I want change. Absolutely. I have visions for that. I am an expert in certain areas. I have ways in which I can see our knowledge structures, our sense-making systems to be completely corrupt. And I believe I have corrections on some of those things that have many, many big-time downstream effects. So my task, if we're going to evolve into this time between worlds and find ourselves on the backside of this chaotic decade with some degree of sanity, is to play my role in threading a tapestry together with other seers. I do think that Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jordan Hall, Jim Rutt, they're seers, and they have a very important angle. Do they have the whole thing? Of course not. It's just ideas. I mean, the Game B's an idea. You have to see what would happen and how much should race be, emphasized. I look out for people. Who do I really think are unbelievably visionaries? Well, Greg Thomas, he's a visionary. I'm going to try to elevate him because that will make salient exactly the kind of concerns that often aren't. Okay. So, I can't defend or don't really want to be in a position trying to, defend schisms and other things that are
Yeah.
pretty far away from my areas of expertise and much more
Mhm.
direct knowledge.
And I talked to Greg once so far actually, and you know, I got his back and he says he's got mine, but I am a little bit critical of him because he's trying to do this radical centrist thing. And I think it's important. Somebody has to be in that kind of position and mediate. But, you know, I insisted to him that it's only going to work if he's like, really like representing, let's say, my side, and trying to facilitate people's awareness and openness to that broader point. Anyways, I want to pivot to, we can kind of jump off game B to like back to Pinker on this
Sure.
issue of existential risk, because I think to game B's credit, they are about existential risk and you know, promoting the salience of that, and so, you know, there's a divide there. They would criticize Pinker for being negligent about this issue, and I mentioned to you, like, Phil Torres is not like a game B guy, but is somebody who has battled with Pinker, and Pinker's response always, it seems, to whoever it is to disparage that person, right? To straw man them and to say, oh, you're not worth listening to. And that's, I mean, that's interesting on a number of levels, but I've been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. Bottom line, I just think it's highly irresponsible for an academic. Now, that's not to say that they should address every point of every critic. That would be, he'd be doing it for the rest of his life, right? It'd just be a slog and it'd be sort of pointless. But I think Phil Torres is right? I think the game B people are right about existential risk, that we should take these things seriously and foreground them. And
I agree that
mm-hmm.
That needs to be highlighted,
Yeah.
far more than Pinker does.
Yeah. So I'm not even talking about race, but I'm highlighting the fact that Pinker, and this speaks to my critique of him, that he just, what he does is, not only does he not take criticism seriously when real critique is incredibly serious, he mocks, he dismisses and scorns, blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, the kind of case in point is in my IDW critique, I have these slides from Pinker. Pinker's given a presentation, and to his credit, you know, he seems aware of the critiques against him. He seems so aware that he can package it in a way that just mocks his critics. And I think this is deeply irresponsible. And so, you know, he says intellectuals hate progress, implying that, you know, like intellectuals like himself don't hate progress. He's all about progress, but he's implying that anybody who criticizes him is just career climbing or whatever. And, you know, the slides are incredible because he's straw manning his critics and saying, you know, the slide says, if you think we can solve problems, you have a blind faith in the false promise, the myth of onward march, blah, blah, blah. And you're a cheerleader for boardroom ideology in Silicon Valley. And so I think, I say in my article, I think some of these are valid criticisms against Pinker, and he's embracing all these labels just to mock them and to say, I'm better than you. And the straw man is the headline framing. If you think we can solve problems, I do think we can solve problems. I'm not criticizing Pinker to say just that, oh, his optimism is naive, but that he's not solving the problems. Problems are getting solved precisely because of the vanguard progressives, like what we call social justice, people who actually put their careers on the line, they take risks to speak out. And so we have this inversion where people are afraid of airing their opinion when that opinion is not really to advance, it doesn't really help advance the goals of social justice. So I just can't, at this point, I just can't take Pinker or Peterson or any of these guys seriously, because they're starting from a defensive point, and it's they in the terms of the discourse and who their fans are and how these things go, it actually undermines our own common interest.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, again,
Yeah,
there's
he
a lot
doesn't
of different.
deserve your 100% support. That's the bottom.
Okay, well, let me be clear about what I said in the
Mhm.
obviously, when I said I 100% support him,
Mhm.
I did not then mean that everything Pinker's ever written, said, or
Mhm.
done
Mhm.
is I am now 100% support. What I meant, obviously, was in the context of the controversy, and that is, I thought the controversy was, uh, was whatever the open letter opened up an argument on him that I 100% supported his side in relationship to the open letter. I thought the open
Yeah.
letter was uh, you know, I understood it, but I completely disagreed with it. And I would then say, Pinker, stand up and say, "Yep, I don't know who those guys are," and do that kind of frame of reference, and have the media basically make the open letter say, "Yeah, no, this is not the way we want to go. We'll make a mockery out of this extreme progressive left activism, thought police, and it will go poorly." I was glad that it seemed to go poorly in the mainstream media. That's what I supported. Does that mean that I believe that enlightenment now, every chart in there, and the fact of the matter is that we're in great shape? No, I'm a game beer. I'm arguing that the next 3 decades we are on a trajectory, although I do believe in enlightenment progress, and I do overall believe that we live in very good times. My son just had appendicitis, and if it was unbelievably great treatment, and he's gone back to school tomorrow. And it happened on Saturday. And if it had blown and he had been in, I had a cyst in my back. If they couldn't have taken that thing out, I'd be miserable for the rest of my life. Thank God. So I am believe in progress. I do believe that Pinker makes a very compelling case
Yeah.
for us to have optimism. I also believe that the trajectory, just because you can't endose, but past does not mean present. I mean, and future. And there are a lot of good reasons to believe that trajectory is going to turn if we don't change. That's why I believe in the seers that are saying it's time between worlds. We have to recalibrate. The whole mission of the theory of knowledge is to say this is what we get wrong. I mean, Pinker, How the Mind Works, okay, a brilliant book. I can critique the crap out of it in relation. And it was very influential to me. It's very powerful. But he opens up, he's an evolutionary psychologist who adopts a neurocognitive functionalist view. And 3 minutes into the How the Mind Works, he's saying, well, we really don't know anything about subjective experience or consciousness. This book doesn't say anything about that. So, oh, well. So let me be clear. I just wrote a book called How the Mind Works, but I don't know anything about subjective consciousness or experience. This is all in the language of neurocomputational control and evolution of computational algorithmic processing, and nothing in relationship to subjective experience of being. Well, Van Damme, man, that's not a great How the Mind Works, right? You're going to believe some stuff out, not to mention the fact that there's a whole bunch to be said about the way humans justify that then connects into culture and feeds back onto culture and connects sociology and human psychology, who's completely absent in his work. I'll critique it. So let me be clear on the record. I simply meant in the context of this debate, there's no doubt about where I'm voting. I think the open letter was misguided. I think it was part of, a misguided leveraging inside the academy that works against. So you want to talk about works against. So you go to the IDW and say, you guys are reacting. All right. When you do that, I go over and say, well, turn to the people that are left of you and tell them, yes, this is serious. Okay. And when they behave ridiculously, you should stand up and say, yes, I have a limit. I have a limit but look what happened to Brett Weinstein, at Evergreen. There are limits to this. And we better be aware of what those limits are. And so we each have responsibilities to regulate where the extremes that we are standing around. So that's, I would invite that.
So if you go one step further, which you can do in the form of steel manning, and Brett Weinstein should certainly do this and stop interviewing fascist propagandists like Andy No, like this just inflames the problem. But if you go one step further and say, okay, even though these activists are going to the extreme in their tactics and it's misguided and it's counterproductive, what is the root cause, right? And so we've sort of foregrounded that, you've steelman their position. But I'm saying to go one step further in terms of analysis and then sort of plant yourself there on that side. And it comes back to the actual means for systems change, like again, the Bernie Sanders platform, things like a Green New Deal. And, you brought up sort of surgery and healthcare. And that's kind of what I'm trying to hone in on here, because, that's a huge part about what the battle is in the United States. They don't have universal healthcare, and even less people have healthcare now because of the pandemic. And so at the basic level, what real progressives, what socialists are advocating for is universal healthcare, right? This is what most countries
certainly
have.
for that.
Yeah,
Yep.
we in Canada have it. It's not perfect. It could be improved to the extent that it is a bit privatized and corporatized, and there's not enough investment in it. So you have all these wait times just to see a doctor or psychiatrist or whatever. And so it's better that it's public and that it's free and there's less of paperwork and all that. But it's still underfunded, right? And this is fundamentally what it comes down to, is like, this is the substantive debate we should be having, and that leftists are always trying to have in the foreground. If we could just like solve the culture war stuff on a more abstract level, then we could get on the same board in terms of voting strategy and the actual policy outcomes, right? So, and so I'm always trying to go a step further in the analysis and say, hey, come back over to our side,
Well, I mean, I think in general we could agree with that. We could, so at the level of, I want to think systematically, socially, and structurally about what are the values that we have, where are we, where do we want to get. I think that certainly in the United States, the political polarization is around identity, okay, cultural identity. You have white identitarians on the one hand, and you have the progressive identity on the other, and that has captured all of our attention. And my sadness is that what has happened is that they both regressed into totalitarian spaces around this and now capture all of our attention as it becomes either or. Okay. So if we want to sidestep out of that and think about social structural issues, absolutely. To me, that is a path. And because I'm located in the left, I look over at the left extremists. I mean, this is what I tell the people in my program all the time. It's like, the way you are positioning this, on the one hand, I get it. You get leverage. Look what happened with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. We got a lot of leverage there, right? But at the same time, the rhetoric's very dangerous. There is a lot. Critical race theory is a good critique, but it's not a substantive argument about reality. At the level of what something to build off of. It's a critique, like virtually all post-structuralist positions is, and we need a meta-modern synthesis, that aligns our various sensibilities, transcends and includes them, and then thinks seriously about the deep values of the society we want to see in the future.
Yeah. So I'm insistent that on this point, that if we actually do build a synthesis, that it doesn't mean everybody can retain their political identity. So I'm not talking about racial identity, but just say, let's say a conservative, a Trump supporter, and there's lots of examples I can draw from, the kind of few conservatives in the meta-modern community that still support Trump. Like, they don't have to. You can be conservative and not support Trump, but they insist. And a better sort of case in point, because it's recent, is, I've done 2 interviews with Veracity now, and I did a Q&A with his Discord. And this is a meta critique I try to make against him and you and Game B or Rebel Wisdom, all these people, is because there's something going on in the way they talk about things and who their audience attracts. And, you're trying to, just teach and promote wisdom and psychology and all that, and that's fine. But in Vervace's Discord, there was a couple people that were like, this guy, Sargon of Akkad, he's a YouTuber, he's far right. And Tim Pool, also, sort of from the left, but he's a far right grifter. And they have huge platforms. And these things came up, and I was like a little shocked and surprised, but also a little bit like, okay, yeah, that's par for the course, because people like Vervaeke aren't addressing that stuff in the first place. And so it comes up. And so point being, these guys agreed that Sargon of Akkad is a troll, but they didn't think he's racist. I'm like, no, he's racist. Like he uses the N word. Like he is a troll. He tries to make light of all these things, but fundamentally, Sargon's whole MO is sort of to grift. Now, whether that's conscious or unconscious is beside the point. But the point I made to this Q&A is that, you know, Tim Pool and Sargon of Akkad are making a lot of money doing what they do. They have popular platforms because in a sort of predatory way, they're exploiting the fact that the public discourse isn't very cogent and people don't really understand these issues. So they react. So they're reactionaries. And so bottom line is Game B, Vervaeke, you know, to his defense, he's told me he didn't know much about Game B. It's like, well, I'm just friends with so-and-so. I don't really follow it that closely. Okay. But my critique is that the reactionary culture is embraced or at best kind of ignored and papered over in these communities. And you know, when I pressed Jim Retto on it, he says, well, we want to embrace we want to kind of have a bit of diversity. Ironically, he wanted to fill a diversity quota and have reactionaries in those communities. But my bottom line is that not just that Vervaeke or you should denounce these types of fans or Sargon of Akkad, it's that you have a responsibility to try to teach them and to bring them back in. So not to denounce them. I tried not to denounce them, but I also tried to be blunt and forthright and say, you know, I've done my homework. These guys aren't serious critics. They just have large bases because they kind of pander. You know, Tim Pool's making anti-AOC videos every week. And it's just, it perpetuates the culture war because people are so confused. So I think we have a responsibility as intellectuals to address this. And it's difficult to address. These people that were for Sargon of Akkad got really upset when I started to critique him and say, well, there's been lots of leftists debating these people. They get discredited all the time. And so it kind of comes back full circle to my point that I think most of these meta type thinkers are kind of, they kind of drift to the center for, let's say the right intentions, right? There's a kind of pragmatic drift to kind of go there because it's more common ground. But in so doing, and again, Peterson really helps facilitate this, the anti-leftism means that you don't even factor in any time in your schedule to like read or watch shows or outlets that are really the best representation of left positions. And so, you know, a case in point is just like Jacobin, but Jacobin's not without its problems too, because, you know, we're both sympathetic to the MMT position, and a lot of leftists are kind of on the fence about MMT. And so this is an interesting conflict, but just, I know I'm rambling here, actually. My broader point is just that, you know, you talk to people, they know who Tim Pool and Sargon of Akkad is, but they don't know who, you know, the key authors on the left or the key activists on the left are. And, you know, to your credit, to Steelman U, it's because you get so overwhelmed by this continuous onslaught of diversity meetings and whatnot. You know, you find comfort in the kind of Atlantic articles, New York Times articles that toe this centrist line. So I think it's a major crisis, though, that we've lost sight of the serious post-capitalist critique from the left that transcends a lot of these issues. And I think that's where we need to be.
Fair enough. I mean, you know, that's a reasonable, I don't really think of, you know, so, I mean, we're all in different places. I'm not sure I think of New York Times as centrist, but you know, I follow the Times, you know, listen, where I am, you know, like I said, for myself, I have my own thread. I'm a psychologist. Okay. You're a sociologist. That puts you immediately in slightly different domains. We're going to have lots of different perspectives on this thing called the political world. You know, my fundamental perspective is that it's sick and corrupt. You know, the language of game A is very useful in game B at that level. You know, I'm trying to lead something, whoever might be gravitating towards me, believe me, I don't know who Sargon is.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
I certainly, I've got less, significantly less elevated than Bard or
mhm,
Vervaeke. I've got my vision, and I'm trying to advance it. I'll
mhm,
certainly have a big tent. I wouldn't want to be policed in terms of that. But at the same time, I have very clear values about what I'm trying to move toward. And that's what, for me, what I invite, that's why I have a very clear value statement: dignity, well-being, integrity, and the vision. That's what people need to commit to. They can come from a wide variety of different areas. I can read George Will and have an enormous amount of respect for his intellectual position on the world,
mhm,
and would welcome people in those kinds of ballparks. So the fact of the matter is that I wish that we would return to a sane, what I would consider a sane left concern with social structure related issues. Yes, identity is a big deal, but I wish we would shift the focus more to capital related social structure issues rather than social category identity issues. I wish we knew where the limits of critical race theory were so that they would not necessarily be highlighted by the extremes. In the same way, I don't want what is that, the strong boys or proud boys or whatever. I mean, we don't, and I'm not making equivalents on those, but I'm just saying
mhm,
that there is a polarizing identity dynamic
mhm,
that
mhm.
is drawing a huge amount of our attention. It's doing it in a destructive way. We have an enormous number of problems, ways of thinking about these problems that sidestep the sick, corrupt system.
Mhm,
I did see, to come back to the open letter, I see that as a
mhm.
symptom of the problem. That's why I critiqued it, and why just I meant in that context, no, that's the extreme stuff you don't want to be doing. That adds more static and
Yeah.
pushes your intellectual deep web people or dark web people
Mhm.
off, and makes them react. And don't do that, because we
Mm.
want to keep more sanity
Yeah.
together. So that's basically my, a statement about what, and I think we should just, stay engaged and recognize that the tapestry of positionality, meaning we're all makes up the whole. We embrace that tapestry, try to rise above what the ultimate values are, and then stay engaged with respect and listening to
Mhm.
people, and realize that we're each occupying a particular space in the world, and try to do the best from that space.
Yeah. Can you, if I'm to sort of make it personal for me in this context, like, can you understand how hard it is for someone like me and how much work it creates? Because I think the letter against Pinker, like, it's nuanced, and a lot of other people unpack that nuance in those 24 defenses of it. And again, like the author there, who's a fellow, um, highlights the fact that most of those or all of those supportive letters were like medium posts as opposed to being published in the more mainstream outlets. So again, it's a media problem that is creating that imbalance that in the end makes you take a hardline position. And I'm saying maintain that nuance if you can, that you're able to steel man it, stay in that uncomfortable space,
But
because you do
yeah, well,
yourself a disservice.
well, actually, this is where, this is where we disagree, because this is, I want you to maintain there's enormous amount of nuance in the intellectual dark web. I mean,
And I
there's
covered it in my
yeah.
article.
Well,
That's
but
the thing. I did this.
the
I covered it.
so
It's all like been foregrounded that, okay, yeah, Jonathan Haidt, has done some good things, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not being insincere, but I did that. So these Quillette writers, with the exception of a few leftists who get to write there, it's like there's a lot of gish gallop, right? And I'm asking you to sympathize with me, the enormous work it creates just to try to keep up with the nonsense, and to have to be replied to with this hyperbole. You're 100% behind Pinker, right? Remember who Pinker fundamentally is and what he did. And it even says in the New York Times article, he defended Jeffrey Epstein. He offered legal advice on behalf of Jeffrey Epstein for his friend Alan Dershowitz. Like, if we really get into the grit of these critiques, these are like very powerful, famous celebrity intellectuals, as the New York Times stipulates, who think they're above reproach. but there's deep consequences to this.
Well,
Like Alan Dershowitz is a pro-Israel hawk, you know,
right.
and
Well, if you want to be nuanced, make sure you allow my context comment to be contextualized. I don't know Pinker super well. I don't know his personal history. It was crystal clear what I meant in terms of 100% behind him in relationship to this context. So
I'm saying even in the context, and I'm trying to
well, I know you are, but I don't agree.
Okay. Okay. So that's the context of your statements. But what about the broader context of my critique, which is like, you know, again, that the fact Alan Dershowitz is a pro-Israel hawk, and that's you know, it's an extremist position that the liberal center actually embraces to some extent, like the Obama doctrine, you know, is just towing the line of neoliberal and neoconservative policy towards with respect to Israel. You know, I take somebody like Chris Hedges. You know, he's a proper leftist and a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and he was canceled from the New York Times years ago precisely because he's a good journalist. And so you're saying you want the left to kind of return to form, right? And I'm saying there is thousands of serious left scholars, critics, pundits, whatever you want. And that discourse is always happening. And in my view, like I've tried to position myself from a meta perspective. You know, I don't do a lot of leftism, but I just support these thinkers, these YouTube channels, whatever it is, because it's consistent. It's becoming more and more crystallized. You know, and the movements keep being suppressed by the police state, like Occupy and the pipeline protests and the, you know, and so again, it's under the framing of capitalism. And you have to, I insist that the context of these things has to come through the way I frame it, not the way Game B frames it. Because Game B tries to wash its hands of its sort of complicity in it. And I think on an intellectual level, we could just do a lot better, you know. And it's so, you know, this is why we're having this conversation, right? We can kind of converge a little bit. Same with Alexander Bard, we can converge a little bit, and he can say, yeah, you want to end racism and the war on drugs. And I'm like, exactly. But that's what that was a huge cornerstone of Bernie's platform. And people like Bard repeatedly were dismissive in emails saying, you know, you're crazy, you're autistic, you know, this is infantile projection. And so I was getting a lot of that hate from the right and the center, even though Bard as an intellectual, you know, kind of positions himself beyond the IDW, then that's, you know, that's great. I love to hear him critique Peterson too. But, you know, case in point, I think just listen to the actual left, find those voices that you like read Jacobin, read Current Affairs, watch the Young Turks, you know, the Michael Brooks show, which I've been promoting for years.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of those.
You've seen a couple, a few people have seen a couple, and you know, it had a particular brand that is maybe not super inviting for everybody, but he was giving a meta perspective on geopolitics and on the kind of the capitalist framing of these culture wars, and you know, a lot of the same things I was saying. And again, point being, it's just like, I'm not being heard, Pinker's being defended. And I think it should be inverted, because at least like you call me a friend, like you and I are talking, and Pinker doesn't need anyone's support or defense. He's got a 38-page CV or whatever. It's like, just retire already. You know, you're not adding anything to the discourse at this point. But that's, you know, I say that out of respect. You know, like, get out, Steven Pinker, because your critics are right. Your critics are right. And that is the bottom line. If we're just going to do this back and forth forever, then we all lose. And so I'm willing to be like wrong and disproven about a lot of things, but I try to take this nuanced meta perspective and meta critique and auto critique, because it's what will actually help transcend these culture wars.
Okay. Well, I mean, you know, I'm not sure. I mean, we can, a few things certainly that I will say that we certainly agree on. I think we can, you know, I feel like I can empathize with why they did that. Okay. I think it's a mistake at multiple levels still, just that's my, I think it works against the cause. Okay. And the reason it works against the cause is because I think the real message was not to Pinker, as I told you in my email. The real message is to the rest of the academy and other linguists out there that basically says, toe the line of this narrative. That's that to me. And
what
to
if
me, that's
what if fundamentally their narrative is correct though? Because that is
well, okay. Well, then that's where we
Yeah.
disagree. Is that then we could have gone through the 6 items that they listed, and each one of the claims that are made in relationship to Pinker. And Pinker, in my estimation, is doing. Yes, I could see why you would critique it. Each one of those claims potentially could be like, oh, I wish you'd frame it differently. And I would have been much more sympathetic to the letter if they'd said, well, we don't think you should be the media go-to person. The fact that they wanted to
what they said though.
Well, that was half of it. They also said they wanted to remove him as a fellow. They wanted to diminish his status. Okay. And, so that to me was the cancel culture mob. And like I said, it wasn't designed to stop Pinker's free speech or his status. That's already established. It's designed to send a message that Pinker's not towing the line. So, I've got about 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay. I'll just quickly ask, what should they have done? And then I want to try to talk about MMT for a bit before we finish.
Okay. Certainly we have concerns it would have been a much more reasonable letter. And like I said, the media issue was more debatable. To try to remove him as a status for his linguistic fellow was by far the area in which I thought you guys are way overstepping the bounds. Okay. The other thing that I just don't like, I don't like what I do see. Here's the basic issue. Okay. I see critical race theory and sociology shifting completely from complex dynamics of culture and structure into, well, language creates structure. Structure is what we need to do. So we're going to monitor your language. The linguist Pinker better not be using things like urban crime because we know that's a dog whistle. Okay. That to me is totalitarian language police. It grants an enormous power to language that I think often is overshot. And it puts individuals in moral, righteous policing modes that is absolutely not where we need to be in relationship to the academy. And I want to push back on those kinds of issues. So I think they grossly overshot. And the idea that they would remove him as a fellow based on something along those lines is, in my opinion, ridiculous and egregious. It still is. That's why for me, it was misguided. So
yeah, they may have overcorrected, and I think you're definitely overcorrecting.
That's inevitable.
So, yeah,
kinds of issues. Okay.
That's where we have to leave that issue.
Yeah, but welcome to, it's a diversity. I'm a lover of diversity of both beliefs and the rainbow racial colors. And
I'll just say, like, to kind of reiterate some of the points I was making the connections with Israel and stuff, that these issues are all connected. They're all connected. And there are tons of sociologists that are doing this kind of systems work. It's just the field is so broad and fragmented, if you will. You can't even keep up with it, and that's the truth in any field. You can't even keep up with the research. So we're all kind of screwed, and shot in the foot. And I kind of touched on.
We had a macro level knowledge scheme.
If only we had an internet and a serious discourse. But I touch on this in my thing with Vicky. But so MMT, okay, MMT is a leftist position, okay.
Yep.
But it's utilized across the political spectrum to do these stimulus packages and whatnot and fund the military industrial complex, et cetera. But it's a leftist position politically because we're advocating to use that for structural reform. Okay. Stephanie Kelton, probably the most famous proponent, was Bernie Sanders' advisor. And so on a simple level, again, this is why I say don't overreact to the culture war stuff. If we believe in substantive change, and we believe in MMT, vote Bernie Sanders. MMT, that, and if I can make a critique against Bernie, it's that he didn't unpack that enough for the quote unquote American people. Like in the debates, he gave kind of wishy-washy answers about how things would be funded, even if those would work, right? Because we got to tax billionaires and all this. but he didn't lean into the really intellectual mobilization behind his campaign. I think he should have given MMT as an answer, right? But so there's that. I can critique Bernie, but I'm saying MMT, can that be a point of unity for us on the left to make you want to vote for it? Because Bernie was the path to that, right? Biden, we're going to face a lot of trouble.
Sure. I'm not an economist. I said that, I had to take a few courses in economics in my car. Okay. I never took a course in economics. I have lots of knowledge systems available to me. Obviously, I sit in psychology, but it's a big world out there. Okay. My brother is very knowledgeable, okay, about just financial systems, economic markets, etc. Okay. So, I can learn about MMT, modern monetary theory, for those of you, and realize that it offers a wonderful potential reframing of what deficit is by a currency issuing system like the United States, and realize what taxation and spending fundamentally is about, and why a deficit for a currency issuing system is completely different than deficit or debt at a state level, or even more so at a home level. Okay. Totally different issue. So when we say, oh my God, the government owes however millions of dollars, trillions, $21 trillion, debt deficit kind of relations. And we should fundamentally rethink about really deploying the actual wealth that the government has available in terms of the economic, socio-political structures, and then delivering that to create incentives, to create change. And really it's the deployment of taxation and spending inside of that we have available. Not thinking about it like I'm spending $1. It's actually I'm deploying money and regulating taxation flow. That's brilliant to me. That changed the way I thought about money in a particular way. Okay, great. And I'm totally supportive of that. Now, I talked to my brother who's interested in international finance, marketing elements, what money is, issues of trust, funding, issues of currency inflation in relationship to other kinds of elements, the government debt, debt issues with China and other kind of expenditures, how things are regulated. And I'll tell you right now, he starts talking to me about the interplay between how we manage our books and the various economic financial markets in the international world. And I'm right immediately over my head. Okay. So then he's like, monetary money, while it's excellent at certain ways, potentially creates an inflationary disaster. Although, as he said, essentially, ironically, Trump and with the COVID, we're essentially doing it in some ways. I mean, there are ways in which we're spending money. So I need to know the bounds of my expertise. I'm a psychologist. I have brilliant expertise in psychology that have huge implications. I'm going to stay there. You make a case to me, just like Jason Bessie did. We put it on the list. Monetary makes sense to me at one level. It's very powerful. I wish to God we would get out of the various elements. And I believe, and that's what I said 6,000 ways, here's a leverage to the left that we should be emphasizing. It shows a fundamental change in relation of what the government can be used to employ to social justice related issues, to managing structural issues. And so, yeah. Now, me knowing that, does that mean immediately I would vote for Bernie if I don't think he could win? That's a whole nother set of questions. But I had learned about him I didn't 3 years ago. I wouldn't even known what the hell that thing is. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm learning, I'm opening. I will say to you, for me, I wish to God that book was getting a lot more attention than an anti-racist ideology book. I think that'd be a hell of a lot better for the left at the level of fundamentally understanding the core social structure of change, because I think poverty and inequality and those kinds of issues warrant a lot more attention. Not to say that I've devoted my life to lots of racial issues. I want the audience to know that. I feel deeply about those issues. I believe in structural inequality, racial structural inequality that we need to address. It's just the way it is done relative to what could be done. I think you get a lot more following agreement if it were leveraged in a particular way. So I think at that level, you and I have a lot in common.
All right. Lots to disagree with there, but we'll have to put a pin in it for next time.
All right.
Thanks for indulging me, Greg. I think I hope we made some headway. It's definitely, we found a way to make it happen and to sort of enjoy it. So that's a first step.
Man, absolutely. And really, let's if we use a little bit of meta-modernity from meta-modernity, we're engaged in oral indigenous narrative here. There are obviously these formal ideologies in our understanding and postmodern critique, but Brent and Greg having a conversation, it's all good at that level for me.
All right. Until
right,
next
man.
time.
Until next time.